Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forward Global Women webinar. We are going to start our webinar, even though we still have people left to join us, but they can just miss my opening comments if they join us late. So we're delighted to be here with you all again in our virtual space, and we're delighted to have with us two remarkable women. First, just a few words about Forward Global Women. My name is Sandy Pappas. I'm a state senator in Minnesota, and I'm one of the co-founders of Forward Global Women. A little over 10 years ago, we founded the organization, myself, my partner, Rina Bartal from Israel, and our Jordanian partner, Professor Rula Kwawis, of blessed memory. She's passed away, unfortunately, but we kept going in her memory. We formed the organization to bring together women in the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, to women leaders from both civil society, academia, and government. And our whole point was we wanted to get to know each other, to network, to learn from each other, to learn from the great speakers we brought in, and help us all to be better leaders and better peacemakers. We are convening for peace. The countries that have been involved are Jordan, Israel, America, Palestine, and in Northern Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt. And we're actually hoping to have a Libyan join us. I'm very pleased to say that after several years of webinars and not being able to get together, we have scheduled our next in-person convening, which is going to be in September in Athens, Greece. So that's wonderful news for everyone. And we hope to have, our topic is going to be on gender-based violence. So this is a great introduction to our in-person convening. We're going to be hosted in Greece by the World Hellenic Interparliamentary Association and several women's groups. So we will have women from Greece and Cyprus joining us, which will also be very exciting. So today on the webinar with us, excuse me, is Cheryl Thomas, who is the founding director of Global Rights for Women. There's Cheryl. Since 1993, Cheryl has worked with partners around the world to promote women's human rights and achieve effective legal reforms to end gender-based violence. She's participated in the drafting of new laws against violence against women and girls and trained legal and community professionals to enforce such laws in dozens of countries, including Morocco. I'm very pleased to have you joining us, Cheryl. Thank you. And I've actually known Cheryl for many years. Also joining us is my colleague and my seatmate on the floor of the Senate, Senator Mary Kunesh, who is a Standing Rock Lakota Sioux descendant. She was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2016 and elected to the Senate in 2020. She's the first woman of Native descent to be elected as a Minnesota state senator. Congratulations to you, Mary. She's passed legislation to create the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office. She also serves in leadership in the Minnesota Senate as an assistant minority leader for us all. So again, I'm very happy to welcome you. Just to mention that we're going to be taking questions in the Q&A function. Please put them there, not in the chat. And we will be happy to take your questions after short presentations by Cheryl and Mary. So now I will turn the webinar, the stage, over to Cheryl, and she's going to share with us some of her work that she's been doing over the years. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Sandy. I am just so honored to be here with these two amazing women, Sandy and Mary, who are just extraordinary leaders here in Minnesota on the issues of women's human rights and violence against women. And it's just really my honor to share the stage with you. So I will just begin. I have 15 minutes and I will begin by telling you a little bit about our organization, Global Rights for Women, and talk then about how we work together with partners around the world and also here locally to achieve systemic and legal reform on violence against women and girls. Yeah, we can go to the next slide and we can just see the mission there. Our mission is very focused on violence against women as a human rights violation. And it's really has kind of three pillars. We work with leaders around the world because nobody can do this alone, particularly when you're working internationally. It just has to be owned by the women in the local community. And the other pillar is we have focused on this mission because we are so deeply aware of what a pandemic this is in our global community. Everywhere we go, we see this pandemic of violence against women and girls. And we believe in legal and systemic change as a really critical way to address this violence and make change. So we can go to the next slide there. Okay. And as I said, the sobering statistics that are behind our mission, every time I look at them, I'm newly alarmed. This report that came out in 2018 that you see there from the UN Office of Drugs and Crimes was particularly devastating. 137 women are killed daily by family members, mostly men, and that's over 50,000 women and girls per year that are killed. And that doesn't even count the injuries and the coercive controlling violence that women experience, and just psychological violence, economic violence. These are deaths. So it's a pandemic that just has to be addressed more effectively in our world, in every community that we travel to. So we can go to the next slide there. Our focus on the law is, we see it as it says here in the title, both transformational in thinking about standards and norms that we want in our community, and also really practical. When we talk about human rights ideals, they can be kind of lofty unless you're really you have a law on the books that authorities can use to enforce women and girls' human right to be free from violence. They're also very practical. They can have funding mechanisms that provide for community interventions like crisis lines, shelters, trainings, funding for trainings for legal system actors. All those are just hugely important aspects of getting a law passed and then starting the hard work of enforcement of that law. So in the next slide, we see that this map that I just named some of the countries that I've had the great honor to be involved in over the years in working with leaders there, women's groups, also government groups, working groups that are starting the process of drafting new laws on violence against women and girls. Most of our work at Global Rights for Women has been on sexual assault and domestic violence, because those are the most common forms of violence against women and girls that we know not only in our own country and community, but throughout the world. We can go to the next slide there. And the laws that are so important at every level. This slide addresses binding international treaty on violence against women and girls. Interestingly enough, there is no such global treaty. We have global treaties on all kinds of issues, as I know many of you know, but there is no one global treaty on violence against women. A group called Every Woman Treaty, some of you may know that organization. We work in partnership with them. They're taking the lead advocacy role, and Global Rights for Women does legal research, and these two papers were published to really raise awareness about the gaps in the international law and how they could be better filled and with stronger norms through an international treaty. And then the Time for Action paper is a kind of a more practical, how do we get this passed? How can we use the familiar mechanisms of the United Nations to make sure that it's enforced, what it needs to look like. So if you're interested in gaining more information about the NGO, Every Women Treaty. You can Google that organization, and these two papers will give you information about, what does CEDAW do, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women? What are the gaps there? Where do we have regional treaties? Where don't we have regional treaties? Who needs them? Who needs that international law standard to really work with their governments to demonstrate that this is something that is globally, these are provisions that are globally accepted around the world, and all countries, all states needs to get on board with these. The next slide there. We work, as our mission states, in partnership. We really work only at the invitation of our partners globally, and in fact here at home, because our view is that those on the front lines of the change and the service provision of sexual assault survivors and domestic violence survivors are the ones that really know what the needs are. They're just, it isn't practical for an international organization like Global Rights for Women to be doing this alone or setting any kind of agenda. Our partnership is at the invitation of local leaders. One of the advantages of local partnerships, being in partnership with local leaders, is they're there. They will own the issue long after we go. They will continue working with victims and survivors, and they know the community and how to navigate the nuances of getting laws passed and then getting them enforced. So here we are in Morocco. This was one of our first trainings that we did after Global Rights for Women was founded in 2014. And this partner has just been one of our most extraordinary partners. Some of you may know Mobilizing for Rights Associates based in Rabat. They have a similar mission. That's really important to us, to be engaged with folks who are working on systemic and legal reform. MRA is at least 10, 15 years old now, and are just a very creative, small organization that, as I say, shares a similar mission with Global Rights for Women. So we can go to the next slide there. In Morocco, our work there with Mobilizing for Rights Associates is our most recent training. Actually was just right before COVID in 2019, and that was soon after the law had passed there. And Mobilizing for Rights Associates has a group of NGOs from around the state that they work with, in addition to stakeholders in the legal system. And they were interested in starting to monitor the enforcement of the law. So we, as a NGO that has a lot of experience with monitoring and coordinating the enforcement of new laws, they invited us to come and train their NGOs and then some key government stakeholders in that. The law on combating violence against women, as I said, passed in 2018. There was some disappointment in that. I'm sure some of you are aware of that. Sexual violence during marriage was not included. There was not clear mandates for legal system actors and what they should do. A number of different weaknesses in the law disappointed our partners there, but it's typical. When to get a new law passed, you make lots and lots of compromises in that language, and then you work to change it. And we know this so well, and Mary and Sandy know this so well in Minnesota. We go back and we make changes to our laws every year. And here Mary is engaged so deeply in getting new laws passed and changes to, like, the sexual assault statute of limitations here in Minnesota. And that has to happen everywhere a new law is passed. Most of the laws around the world are new, like Morocco. and they just aren't going to be perfect the first round. Of course, there's different levels of kind of success that advocates achieve in these laws, but that's the reality when we pass new laws on violence against women. Oh, I'm seeing some great questions in the chat there. I'll just finish here with other examples of our work, and then we'll go on to Mary and I'll take questions. I will really love to do that. Our international work is, we're really all over the world right now. A number of major projects in Southeast Asia and the Caucasus. We'll be traveling to Georgia in May, and also then after that to Vietnam. And both of those projects are at the request and invitation of the local UN Women, United Nations agency that focuses on women. And we'll be building the capacity through tools that we have used here in our country and around the world. Risk assessment, we're doing a prosecutor training to train the trainers how to better enforce sexual assault and domestic violence laws. So that's just a couple examples of our work. That's a picture of our first convening workshop in the Republic of Georgia after we had developed, worked with survivors, focus groups, and then stakeholders to develop a risk assessment tool for police to use in domestic violence cases so that they could understand when women were most at risk of being seriously injured and killed. So we had a week long, those are prosecutors, police, parliamentarians there, and our staff and other NGOs.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I probably used my time here, haven't I, Sandy?
No, go ahead, finish up.
Okay, yeah, just a couple things about Global Rights for Women's local work. This is a core part of our values to make sure that we're working locally, since we draw so much on the 40 years of expertise in the United States. First laws passed in the 1970s on domestic violence and sexual assault. So we have lots of expertise in the United States. And not only do we learn from our successes, but we learn from profound weaknesses as we go forward. Our Minneapolis police, for example, has much work to do in responding to sexual assault and domestic violence calls and making sure that we aren't deeply oppressing marginalized communities, as we know so well from the George Floyd murder. And then we also have our direct service program at Global Rights for Women, which anyone can actually observe. It's online, and we do batterers intervention programs that are aimed at changing the behavior of men who use violence, and they go to those programs as part of their probation after they're convicted of domestic assault. So I do look forward to answering your questions, and I have a list here that we can look at later if we want to on ways you can get involved and just participate in the, I believe, important transformational global change we're undertaking for women and girls. Thank you so much.
Lily, why don't you leave that last slide up for a while? And I want to take just one question that Mohammed has put in the Q&A for Cheryl, because it's so relevant to what she's talking about. And that is, how do you view Moroccan women and the gains they've achieved? And how, do you have any sense of how that compares to other Arab and Islamic countries? How are women's rights doing in Morocco?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think Morocco has had this really effective group of not only NGO activists, civil society activists, but also I'll never forget the parliamentarians I met there, it was at least a decade ago, that were committed to this issue. Of course, they have forces working against fully realizing women's human right to be free from violence. But the fact that the law has passed and there is work going forward on enforcing that law, I have seen transformational. I first started traveling to Morocco in 2007 and have been back there, I don't know, 7, 10 times, something like that, in different trainings. And it's very visible, palpable change has happened.
Great. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I really appreciate that. And we'll look forward to some more questions after we hear Mary's presentation. I'm delighted to bring Mary back up. And I just want to make one comment, because you mentioned the whole issue of sexual assault, that difficult, as you mentioned, to get things passed. And we're very happy to get that passed, that now women who experience sexual assault no longer have a limited time in which they can file charges against their offender. We eliminated what's called the statute of limitations, and that was a major victory here in Minnesota, because many times women don't really face the trauma that they experienced until later in life. Mary, happy to bring you up, and I think you're controlling your own slides, so we'll look forward to your presentation.
Well, Hehane Washte. Good morning, everybody. I'm Petu Kunesh Ante Washte. I greet you all with a good heart and a warm handshake. I'm Senator Mary Kunesh, and as Sandy said, I just joined the Senate 2 years ago, having been in the Minnesota House of Representatives for 4 years, which is where I was able to begin the work on this, addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Minnesota. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done here in Minnesota. It is national leading. We have moved the legislation in more ways and more soundly than any other state here in Minnesota. And it really does take a full legislature to do that. And so really pleased to do that. My family, my mother's family is from the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. She and my grandfather were enrolled tribal members. And my aunt was the very first woman chairperson of the Standing Rock Nation. And so those are the sort of role models that I grew up with. A lot of strong Native women in my family. And so I'm happy to channel them when I need them. The injustice of MMIW, and this is global for women. I would say anywhere a nation or a continent has been colonized by East Europeans, but here in Minnesota, even though our American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state's population, within those 8 years of 2010 to 2018, 8% of all the murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And between those 8 years of 2012 and 2020, anywhere between 27 to 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota were missing. Not always found, some were found and others were found murdered, but these are high rates of any other group of population in Minnesota. And this has been going on since ever, to tell you the truth. I usually wait for a minute and ask this question to people when I'm presenting, if they know how many tribes, how many federally recognized tribes there are in Minnesota. And oftentimes, I would say 90% or more have no idea. So they're not that familiar with our tribal nations here in Minnesota. But we have 10 tribal nations that share the geography with Minnesota. The lands that we live on in Minnesota are the indigenous lands of the Dakota people. And as they moved westward, and remember, there never used to be these boundary lines. So like North Dakota, South Dakota, comprise of a lot of our Dakota family members. Within the Dakota family, let's say, we have Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota. And mostly it's just the dialect or the region that folks lived in. My family was from just the North Dakota, South Dakota border area, Standing Rock and Cannonball. So our family identifies as Lakota. So it's just that L and N and D that makes the difference. And most of our Nakota relatives are up in Canada. But here in Minnesota, we have these 10 nations, and you'll see on the left, there are a list of our tribes: Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, White Earth, Lower Sioux, Upper Sioux, Prairie Island, and the Shakopee, Mdewakanton Sioux. Those are all tribes that are federally, have federal jurisdiction from the federal government. The federal government is responsible for a lot of the policing that happens, especially at high level crimes. On the right are two tribes that are exempt from this public law 280, Red Lake and Boys Fort. They refused this option for the federal government to assist in those sort of things. Public Law 280 actually withdrew the federal criminal jurisdiction on reservations in those designated states. And Minnesota is one of those, which means that if a non-native person perpetrates a crime of violence or murder, anything to that effort, tribal police do not have the jurisdiction to arrest them or prosecute them, which allows a lot of violence to continue to happen. So this is one of the biggest problems when folks say, why does this continue, or who's responsible for addressing this issue? There is such a myriad of confusion between tribal police, county police, state police, and federal police. When I was elected into the House of Representatives in 2017 was my first year as a legislator. And in that summer, two things happened that really propelled me to do this work around missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. First was that I heard the reports coming out of Canada on their national study, their national investigation on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it was heartbreaking. The stories just moved me beyond. But at the same time, a young woman, Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, went missing in Fargo, North Dakota. And in Indian country, we knew about that. It was on our social media. It went through the communities, and a lot of folks showed up to look for her, but it was Native folks. It was the Native community that was looking for her. It turned out that she was tricked into going upstairs to a neighbor's apartment, 8 months pregnant, beautiful 28-year-old woman, looking forward to her first child, and was never seen again. What happened is that those neighbors had schemed all along to steal her child. So they murdered her, cut the baby from her womb, and threw her body into the nearby river. And when the kayakers found her body, the sensationalism of that situation finally caught the public media. And then they finally started to put out reports or information or what happened to Savannah sort of thing. And it was indeed those neighbors that had stolen the baby, hidden that baby away, and it was within 2 weeks before they found the baby and returned him to his father. These are the kind of situations that really made me stop and think. And I thought, you know, Canada is doing this investigation. Why is the United States not doing it? Quickly, Savannah's act went into legislation at the federal level with Heidi Heitkamp, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, North Dakota is doing this work. Why aren't we doing this work in Minnesota? And then I had like literally an epiphany, like, you are a legislator. This is your job. So I went back into the Capitol that summer and worked with community, with the Native community, to build a piece of legislation that became the task force. And it was really them that gleaned through that piece of legislation, and especially the women that work in organizations that address the violence against women. They were the ones that said, we need this, we don't need this. We want this, we don't want this. And they were the ones that fine-tuned the legislation. But I think we have to go back to all the way back to the doctrine of discovery. This is a papal decree that established a spiritual, a political, and a legal justification for the violence that we have seen throughout history, for colonization and seizure of land not inhabited by Christians. And if you know that papal decree, it basically said that, whoops, I'll go back a minute. It basically said that they send all these explorers out. Any piece of land that you step on that is not a Christian continent, we now claim as ours for Christianity, and you are free to do what you will with the inhabitants, but just make sure you bring all the riches and anything of value back to us. And if you go back and look at Christopher Columbus or many of these explorers' journals and diaries, the stories are horrific. The genocide is intentional, and it was all for land and riches. And our women and our children, our men and our boys are the victims of that. And so once we had this legislation created to create a task force, we had to work hard to pass that legislation through hearings. This young woman, Misty Babineau, on the left, is a survivor of horrific violence. She witnessed her mother being stabbed to death and her grandmother be attacked. She actually has on the palms of her hands the scars from her defense wounds in trying to protect herself. Later on, she was abducted, she was raped, she was beaten, she was left in the woods to die, but she survived. And she came to every single one of our hearings and told her story. It was so painful, but she did it again and again and again because she knew how important it was that we heard the voices. On the right, you'll see the family of Jojo Boswell, her mother and her sister. Jojo had been arrested for a very minor infraction, and I'll just tell you that Native women are picked up and jailed at higher rates than any other group of people as well. She was released from the jail in a town not far from the Twin Cities, called her sister to say she was going across the street to wait for a ride, and they have never heard from her again. Never had nobody has any information on it. Nobody seems to have witnessed it. They have no idea. And when Dolly, the sister, called the police to say, you know, my sister, I just talked, you know, we talked to her not long ago. She's not answering her phone. We don't know what happened. This isn't like her. They dismissed her and told her, literally told her that they had better things to do than go looking for a Native girl. So these are the stories that we have been able to connect with the task force. This is a list of the task force that we did put together. We had representatives both from the House and the Senate from both sides of the, you know, both parties, Republicans and Democrats. We knew that we needed the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, sheriffs, U.S. attorneys, county attorneys, epidemiologists are really play a big role in this because they're the ones that, you know, recognize the trends. We had representatives from every single one of the tribal communities, as well as a number of folks that are already doing the work of addressing violence in our communities, Mending the Sacred Hoop, Lifehouse, Women's Foundation of Minnesota, Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. We also had author and victim herself, as well as one of our researchers, Chris Stark. And Chris Stark has a book out that it's fiction, but a lot of it is autobiographical. She herself was sex trafficked by family members, and she's of Native descent as well. And so we had this incredible group of people together. Unfortunately, we had hoped to go out into the communities and garner a lot of the information, but because of COVID, we weren't able to. But we made sure that we had lines of communication. We had a phone line specifically for folks to leave messages on, email addresses with full access. Folks could send in video testimony. I mean, we just made sure that the community in Minnesota, and we got a lot of information from our neighboring communities as well about their experiences and their family history and trauma. So that's what I have for you here today. I can tell you that we did create that task force and we're able to complete it in 18 months. With that, came a number of recommendations, and the very first one was to create a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives office. It's a permanent office in Minnesota State Legislature. And I have to tell you, we did this with a split legislation. In the Minnesota House, we have the majority Democrats. In the Senate, we have the majority Republicans. So this is a joint effort. This is a bipartisan, bicameral adoption of legislation. Along with the legislation for the creation of our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, which we now have, we have our executive director who is setting up the office. I have legislation this year to create a reward pool so that we can tease out information about these crimes that have happened. And along with that, hopefully, a specialty license plate that those fees will go towards that reward fund. So my mind is always thinking, how can we continue to do the work? How can we continue to do support our communities? We need to look at the systemic issues within our state legislature, within our country, and I guess globally. We need to look at child protection as far as foster care and the adoption line. I'm sure you've all heard of the horrific stories of our kids being pulled from their families for generations, put in boarding schools in an attempt to force them to assimilate, are not allowed to speak their language, practice their religion, their culture. Many of those kids were victims of abuse, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse. Many died, never to return home, and families never really knew what happened to them. And that continues in our foster care system. Again, our Native kids are removed from their homes for minor, what often are minor infractions compared to other groups of kids at the highest rate in the nation. And what happens when they're removed from their family? They're put into the foster care system. They're disconnected from their culture and their family. They become easy prey for sex traffickers and violence and drug self-medication through drugs. Those are all the issues that we deal with as we address this issue. Housing, education, economic development, home ownership. Home ownership is like the one way to build generational wealth. And for our Native families, redlining and lack of resource has made that almost virtually impossible for many, many generations. But fortunately, here in Minnesota, I am in the Minnesota Senate. We have 2 Native women in the Minnesota House. And of course, we have our Lieutenant Governor, Peggy Flanagan, who are doing the good work right alongside me. And when people ask about representation, this is a perfect example of how representation matters. If I hadn't been in the legislature, if we didn't have these other women there to do the advocating, I don't know who would be doing it. And so for me, I feel very fortunate. I feel like I was put in this place and in this time to do this work. And we will continue to do the work, not just for our Native women, but also for all women, because one of the really great things that also came out of this creation of a MMIW task force was that I passed with Representative Ruth Richardson over in the House last year, the first in the nation again, missing and murdered African-American women's task force. And I sit on that task force, and the intersectionality is profound. And I know that that intersectionality is across the world, across our nation. And I'm just really pleased to be here with all of you and be able to share the work that we're doing here in Minnesota, and happy to join forces as well. So Chimigwich, Wopalatanka, thank you very much for inviting me to join you this morning.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that excellent presentation. And we'll bring Cheryl back on as well. I just had one follow-up question for you, Mary. And I wanted to mention to people who aren't from Minnesota or internationally joining us that Peggy Flanagan, our Lieutenant Governor, is a Native woman. So I wanted to make sure that that was clear. We're very excited to have her. She's the highest, I think she has the highest standing Native woman in the country, right? Except we have some women, we have a Native woman in the federal executive branch.
We do. We have Secretary of State Deb Haaland is also, you know, she created a federal level MMIW task force.
Yeah, she's not Secretary of State.
Oh, no, did I say Secretary of State?
Yeah.
Oh, pardon me. Office of the Interior.
Yes, the Interior.
Not Secretary of State.
Thank you. I forgot you. The Mary, I had a follow-up question for you, and then please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to take them from our viewers this morning. Mary, talk a little bit about the boarding schools for Native children and the burial grounds that have been found on the boarding school land. That started, I think, also in Canada. Yes.
I mean, the awareness or calling out. I mean, our Indigenous folks are feeling empowered. They're not going to sit quiet anymore. And atrocity after atrocity is being brought to the public. So there was a time in the United States, what happened is when the settlers came and colonization happened, they moved and they killed, and we had this terrible genocide of our Native people across the continent. Eventually, they put them onto reservations, almost like, I almost want to say like the Jewish ghettos during World War, when they forced all the Jews into one place and wouldn't let them leave. And so there were these treaties that the federal government, agreements with the Indian nations, basically saying, you give us all your land, we're going to pay you pennies on the dime, and then in return, we promise to provide housing, food, clothing, medical attention, and education around those things. Every year, you will have an allotment. We will bring these things to you. You just stay out there on your land and don't bother us anymore. So they put them on the most barren places ever and never fully met their promises. So, you know, we had plenty of our ancestors die due to starvation and disease and lack of resources, all of those things. Then came the time when the mostly Christian religion brought boarding schools into the equation, and that was often supported by the state governments. And they would run these boarding schools. So basically, what they did is they went to Indian families and reservations, literally took the kids and put them in these boarding schools. Oftentimes they said, you know, they threatened, if you don't, we won't give you any food and the rest of your family will basically starve. So the kids went to the boarding schools, they made them cut their hair, they took any of their cultural objects from them, were not allowed to speak any of their own language. It was just horrible. My grandfather's brother, now my grandfather didn't go to boarding school, but my grandfather's brother was removed from the family and sent to Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania. So all the way from the Dakotas to the East Coast, where we found records of him. And there's one card that's sort of like a behavior card, and on it, it lists date after date after date, running. So my uncle kept running away trying to get home. And it wasn't until he fell off of a train trying to run away and had his leg cut off that they finally let him return home. So now these boarding schools are coming to light and people are starting to talk about them. But as I said, hundreds, if not thousands of these children died in boarding school due to disease, sexual assault, murder, all of these things. And they're buried, you know, on the lands of these boarding schools. And families are starting to inquire, where are my ancestors? Where are my relatives? And so at any given Indian boarding school, you will find bodies of children, and we don't even know how many. So now there is a movement to either return those children to their families, or let them lie where they are, but commemorate those as a very sacred spiritual place.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that explanation. That was very helpful. Another sad story and the history and lives of Native people in our country. We did have a question in the chat that I'll address to Cheryl, and that has to do with, is violence against women really an individual thing by men who are just individually violent people and hate women, misogynist, or is this something bigger? Is it something more systemic, or is more part of our culture? Could you just comment on that, Cheryl?
Well, yes, absolutely. I would say both things are true. Our work at Global Rights for Women is rooted in a common dynamic that we see all around the world. And that is the centuries of male entitlement to control and maintain power over women. And that is something that is very present throughout the world today. It manifests itself differently, of course, from community to community. It is rooted in patriarchy and that male entitlement. And we didn't even have laws, prohibiting domestic violence anywhere in the world until the 1970s, much less enforce them. Most of the world's laws on domestic violence, as I said, the most common form of violence, that in the home, that's so entrenched behind closed doors. Most sexual assault is by people that women know. That is the picture of what we have sustained as a global community, is this male entitlement. And I just wanted to reinforce what Mary said too. It also is very so much of our violence is rooted in these intersectionalities. Marginalized women, Native women, women of color, immigrant women. We know that they experience violence, and the lack of effective systemic change and systemic intervention in that power dynamic to a much greater degree than our dominant populations. For example, as Mary so eloquently stated here in Minnesota, there just wasn't legal system intervention. And we see that in our Minneapolis Police Project too, with women of color and immigrant women. They are not getting the services, the legal services and the access to justice that is so important to our mission here at Global Rights for Women, that the dominant population, I will say all women suffer from institutionalized systemic government, complicity in this pandemic of violence against women, and it is exacerbated for the more subjugated and the more oppressed. So yeah. Yes, it is about the patriarchy, and it is about subjugation and oppression globally.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cheryl. Mary.
Yes. So one interesting thing, when we held testimony at the legislature, somebody asked, who is, and we were talking a lot about sex trafficking, because our Native women, of course, are so vulnerable. They are sex trafficked at, again, the highest rates of any other population. And we asked a county attorney from Minnesota, why is this, or who is doing all of this? Who are the general, what's the profile of a perpetrator that is buying this or whatever? She told us that the profile is a white man, mid-30s, had additional income to spend, but he was also a father. So a married white man with disposable income in his mid-30s was the usual profile for those that were buying and continuing the sex trafficking trade. And so, that right there, I think a lot of people were like, what? White men, fathers, husbands?
That young too. Mm-hmm.
And we're all like, well, duh. Once that's out there like that, it has a profound effect when you can actually create that kind of a profile.
One of our board members, County Commissioner Mary Jo McGuire, has an interesting question in the chat. She thanks you both for your leadership locally and globally. You're doing life-changing, transformative work. Please talk about the importance of the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors working together to make the world safe for women. Any comments from either of you about how much you rely on those different sectors?
I can jump in here. Yeah, absolutely. No one sector can do this. We can pass a law and it can sit there on the books. It has to be a coordinated community response to enforce that law and to make these changes. That model was developed, some of you may know, in Duluth, Minnesota in the 1970s and has been replicated around the world. It is rooted in that exact principle, Mary Jo, and thank you for that question. It just has to be a coordinated, multi-sectoral response. The violence that women and girls face is so entrenched. It needs research from academics to bring to the legislators to make sure they have the tool, the grounding they need to pass these laws. It needs, of course, first and foremost, survivor voices. And this is what MRA did so beautifully in Morocco. When I first started working there in Morocco, they had gone around, so many women and girls in Morocco are illiterate. So they wanted to make sure that before they started working on the law with stakeholders like police, prosecutors, judges, parliamentarians, they understood what women's survivors' stories in Morocco were and what they wanted in that law. What were the forms of violence they wanted prioritized? What were the kinds of legal sanctions? Were they civil? Were they criminal? What amendments needed to be made to relating laws, like the family laws, the divorce laws? What types of violence were they experiencing? And since they weren't able to be reading, documents and giving this input in writing, they did a pictorial display that they were able to bring to the legislatures and the government stakeholders so they could see, they could hear directly from survivors of violence. So I just point out, those are the most important voices of all. Survivors who have experienced violence, and they need to lead the way in a coordinated community response in order to make the transformational change we need through law and systems.
Thank you, Cheryl. Mary, we saw the list that you showed us about everyone you had on your task force.
But I would say also on top of the systemic agencies and commissions, the public, the support of the public has been outstanding. I have been able to travel throughout Minnesota and present this. People have asked me over and over again to come and educate them around this. And oftentimes they are faith-based groups, different religious groups that have asked me to share this information. Women's groups, community groups, they all want to know and understand it and learn, and they want to be able to do something about it, which is why I really thought about that reward system, that reward pool, because people are always asking, what can we do? How can we help? Well, you can support, good policy, but you can also put money into this pool. But I have to say, when we look at the different levels of government, we have such a jurisdictional quagmire of, like I said, tribal police, county, state, whatever those, we need to build that kind of collaboration so that there isn't the dismissal of it. But when we look at like the county level, we look at housing, how can we work with our county level, that mid-level government to provide secure, safe, and truly affordable housing for families so that they have that security. They know where they're going to come home to at night. They can keep a job and aren't going to be, you know, having to move around. They can keep their kids in schools. All of those systems need to work hand in hand to provide the kind of stability that that would not create these vulnerable pockets of society. And I know Mary Jo works really hard on those. Our public libraries, access to information and support when you're not sure where to go. Foster care systems. We in Minnesota or in the United States, we have ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. That's not always being followed to the rule of the law. And so it's a lot of re-educating, educating, and then having those support systems available for vulnerable families.
Thank you so much, Mary. Cheryl, any final words? I know you showed that slide earlier, and this presentation will be available on our website shortly for any of you who joined us late or would like to review it. But in terms of women working around the world who need to push their government, any kind of advice that you can give us would be helpful.
Yes, you know, the partnerships I think have just been so important. Partnerships in every way. Just drawing on the passion that Mary describes of the public. There is a sense, and I've been working in this area since 1992, so 30 years, and I've seen this ebb and flow. You know, when women's human rights are prioritized, whether it's at the United Nations or whether it's at the Minnesota legislature, it's palpable right now. And if we can draw on that passion and partner and come together through all these different sectors of society, I think it's a time right now. I'm so deeply, you know, of course, devastated by what's happening in Ukraine right now. But again, the coming together and this crisis, we know that women and girls are sexually assaulted and suffer violence in times of war and other crises, just skyrockets. And right now, I just haven't seen anything like the awareness about that particular factor, the human sex trafficking of those Ukrainian women at the border of Moldova and Ukraine. People understand that that's going to happen. Our government is talking about it. The European Union disaster assistance folks have been trained in it and are talking about it. I'm just seeing this through my networks in a way that I have never seen before. So I think just the continuing to build, to have sessions like this, thank you, Sandy, to build the awareness and to highlight and make, just give a higher profile to these issues.
11 a.m.
is what we need. That was my timer. It's just what we need to continue. And now is the time. Seize these moments when there's so much activity around the world. Thank you.
Yamina made a great comment in the chat about educating boys to respect girls and girls to respect themselves. And I think that's a great topic for another webinar, but absolutely. Unfortunately our time is up. And I just want to thank you, Mary and Cheryl, so much for joining us. I really enjoyed your presentations. Happy to have you, and really want to thank our participants for joining us. And we have more webinars coming, so please watch your inbox for, we have another one coming in May, and the topic will be revealed in the invitation. Thank you again for a wonderful, stimulating presentation this morning, and thank you again for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.